Good morning from beautiful South Bank, the home of the Queensland Conservatorium, which we'd like to acknowledge is on the land of the Yuggera and Turrbal people, unceded land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm Hannah Reardon-Smith. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University, and I'm here with one of my supervisors. This is Dr. Alexis Kallio, who's only recently arrived in Brisbane. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your work.
Sure. I've been working and living in Finland for the past 11 years, and my work has been focused on the politics of arts education, so the way in which individuals and social groups negotiate their identity and exercise agency and make meaning about themselves and other social groups. I've been working together with the Indigenous Sami people in Finland for the last 5 years, both Northern Sami, Inari Sami and also Koltti Sami. And we've been looking particularly at the publicly funded arts education program in Finland, which is really intended to be for everybody, regardless of your background or ethnicity or religion, or, it's really designed to be a very equitable system. Which is extremely commendable, but of course it's experienced very differently from different perspectives and different worldviews and ways of being in the world. So I've been looking together with them, particularly at how their experiences of equality or inequality in that system might help us reimagine it to actually achieve those goals and really realize that vision of equality through arts education as it was intended, I guess. So what I'm particularly interested in now is how arts education, and particularly music, I think, can afford both this collective affiliation, so this feeling of belonging and identification with others and being part of a collaborative group, but simultaneously also be this means for personal expression and a place to explore your individuality. So it's both a collective and an individual expression. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. In my work on improvisation, I think quite a lot about how when sound enters a space, it brings together a kind of experience for all of the people and or other beings who are in that space as a kind of collective experience, even if each individual has a slightly different or sometimes radically different experience of that sounding. Nevertheless, it's like time-bound, so that you're all experiencing this thing, like there's a kind of collective sensational experience of interacting with that sound, and in a way that then means that because each person is kind of forming their own experience of the sound in relation to their own backgrounds and histories, as you say, and it's touching them in personal ways, then they're actively co-creating with the persons or people or animals or whatever is doing the sounding. And so, there's this kind of active making of this collective experience, which I think of in terms of making kin, sort of something that brings people together, even as they're having separate experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what's really interesting about that is when we are doing this relational work through music especially, it cultivates certain skills and dispositions in the participants, and we all do this. This is not just musicians, it's everybody. But I mean, we can all think of a piece of music that's made us think differently about ourselves or about other people. Quite often as teenagers, we remember that one song that we knew all the words to or knew all the chords for, and we still remember, and that really sort of defined who we were or who our social group was, and was a really sort of part of that life-making work. And I think that's what's really interesting in music, in terms of needing to, or giving us the skills to be able to listen differently And I think it's a little bit differently from just hearing differently, like, oh, that's a cool chord, or that's an interesting tone in the bass or something like this. But it's a way of shifting one's perspective in a way, that what was seeable or hearable or doable in the world before has now changed. And I think that aspect of listening is something I'm particularly interested in as well.
Yeah, that really reminds me of there's the incredible work of science fiction writer Octavia E. Butler, who has, in the Parable of the Sower, quite a remarkable piece of writing, this really interesting little passage about kind of the nature of what she's calling in that God, but it's this kind of way of being in the world, which says that everything we touch, we change. Everything that we change, or everything you change, changes you. And that the only lasting truth is change, and God is change. And listening is such a way of touching and being touched. I mean, we have, you sort of spoke about this little difference between hearing and listening, and we have this, like, the sound waves are literally hitting our eardrums. The sensing of sound, hearing, is literally being touched by changing air pressures. And yet we're experiencing it, as you say, in this really complex, like, psychological way that it itself can produce, like, tones that aren't necessarily touching our eardrums with psychoacoustics, but also interact with all of our experiences up until that point. And so,
and
we're being touched, and shape our
yeah.
futures. But it also means that as we're touching that sound, we're changing the sound, because everything you touch, you change.
Yeah.
So you're being changed and you're changing things. So it's this really active kind of difference between just being touched by the sound and then this active co-creation that's taking place. Yeah.
And I think that this emphasis on the active is especially important now. I mean, if we're thinking that, the 21st century represents one of the most peaceful eras in history for a lot of people. That is true. But also the way that we're increasingly characterizing our societies is by division and by differentiation between who is involved in the us and who's the them. And we have rising instances of racism and sexism and homophobia and all of these social problems that I don't think that as artists, or especially arts educators, that we're excused from addressing. I think we have enormous potential through exactly what you've been saying, through this active listening and through co-creating and through really being with one another in order to find different ways of being in the world and different ways to relate to each other. So I've been drawing a lot on the work of a political scientist called Susan Bickford, and she wrote in the mid 1990s already. This is just quite some time ago. So she's been writing about how an active approach to listening. We should be actively listening. An active approach to listening enables us to kind of stick with those really difficult questions. And I think one of the questions we have now in many societies is how to relate to people that we have views that are just fundamentally irreconcilable. So how can we relate to people whose morals are so different from ours and really core values that we're not willing to give up on? And I see listening not as a way to move to consensus, to change people, to say, oh, you're wrong and I'll listen to you and we'll gently guide you towards the right way to think and be. But it's a way of taking seriously what the other person has to say, even if you strongly disagree with it. And I think that music does that so perfectly. If we think, for instance, in an improvisation setting or in any kind of ensemble setting, we have to work with people who play differently to us. And sometimes that can work very smoothly and it's a wonderful experience. And sometimes it's incredibly difficult. Which doesn't mean to say the music is bad or the music is difficult, but sometimes that process of reaching that kind of musical cohesion comes with a lot of active political listening, but with that commitment to care and with that commitment to take seriously what the other person has to say, even if we disagree with it.
I feel here like there's a lot to do with the kind of vulnerability of listening, where you, I guess, once again, you're letting yourself be touched by what's happening, and you're letting yourself be affected by that sound. And yeah, in terms of having conversations with people and like really listening so that you're actually hearing where that other person is at, a little bit more than maybe like waiting your turn to speak. And I guess that's then bringing in, I guess, issues of who's allowed to be heard in what settings, and like who's allowed to be given voice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that that's actually one of the things that led me to this area. So in music education particularly, there's been a lot of really great work done on finding opportunities or fighting for opportunities for marginalised people to exercise voice, or minoritized communities to be included. But then I think going beyond that, we need to think, what are we being included in?
Yeah.
And I think that that's what this active, committed sort of relational work can lead us to in reimagining what that centre is. And I think you're right. I think that vulnerability is a key part of it in learning, sort of listening as an art, and learning to be open, and learning, not necessarily to say that we should be open to changing our values or morals or everything we believe in, but an openness towards others and to sounds or other people or other beings. And I think that's how we can really explore these questions of what are we being included in. And I think that more than inclusion or equity and these kinds of things, looking at that experienced perspective and people's own lived realities of what we're aiming for tells us much more than our own versions of what music is, or what art is, or what educational spaces are.
Yeah. I'm a bit curious, one of the words that you use a fair bit of in your writing is reflexivity. And I'd like to go a little bit more into this in relation to listening, and maybe what that word means for you in that context, and maybe also how thinking of listening through the lens of that word like changes the practice or the experience of listening, or the act and action of listening. I have been writing quite a lot about reflexivity very recently, and I think what I'm interested in is kind of exactly what we've just said in a way. So in questioning what we're being included in. So reflexivity has long been used in qualitative research in order to sort of for the researcher to look back at their positionality and see how they shape the research context. So I think the idea of the researcher taking this neutral, distant stance and having a sort of God's eye view over the situation, that's been dismissed for quite some time now. So in really understanding the researcher as embedded in their work and really shaping the knowledge that is formed from the very beginning, from the moment you even have an idea about a research project, or as you work together with other people, how you listen to each other and come up with questions to ask, or like, how do we know those are the right questions? And how do we know that those are the answers that we need to find, and for who, and who do they benefit, and things like this. So I think that reflexivity has really been touted as a hegemonic virtue of qualitative research, and whenever anybody says something is good, and unquestioningly, I tend to look again. So I've recently written a book chapter which will come out very soon about this, in how reflexivity might actually function to give the researcher more methodological power to without actually achieving that inclusive aim. Which I don't think is a bad aim. I think it's good, and I think that reflexivity, it's not something we should get rid of, but it is something that we should embark upon critically
together with other people, and realize its limitations as well. It's all very well for us to say that the researcher should, turn the camera on themselves and look in that perspective, but you're still looking through the same lens. You still have the same eyes, the same worldview, and it's very difficult for anybody to jump outside of that and to be able to critically look at what you yourself are doing. And for me, I think that that's why this relational work is so important, especially when we're talking about topics relating to equity and social justice. It's incredibly difficult to do by oneself, if possible. So I think that reflexivity is an ideal in that sense, and it's always something that we should strive towards, but also achieve that we never really get that ability to objectively evaluate our own roles, because we are subjective people, and we come to everything. I can't put on a researcher hat that's different from all the other parts of my life. I'm one person, so I think it's necessary to acknowledge that reflexivity has its limitations, and we come with our own baggage too, and just work from there. That it's a possibility, but one will probably never achieve.
Totally. It's an interesting one in relation particularly to arts research, and in particular with arts practice as research, which often involves the researcher, the artist as researcher, looking at their own practice as a way of maybe looking at some broader questions about their particular kind of arts practice. And I think it both has shown some of the possibilities of that kind of reflexivity as well as some of the limitations at times. And I would agree, this kind of idea that this is like, I'm also quite wary of anything that poses itself as a kind of answer to a big problem. It's like there's always going to be room for interrogation and taking further steps to it's got to go through those layers a bit,
And I think it also asks really valuable questions about what constitutes research. And I mean, two of my favorite questions for my own research, but also all of my students, as you know, is so what and who cares? And I think that if we can answer those questions, preferably together with other people, whilst we might not achieve our ideals, I think we're on the right track.
Well, thanks so much for talking today, Alexis. It's been really interesting to get to know a bit more about your research practice. So thank you.
Thank you very much.